The forest of this podcast sure has changed, but the owls are still around. Today we're doing Final Fantasy VIII on Have You Played? Andrei, have you played Final Fantasy VIII?
Oh yeah, let's talk about it.
Yeah, we're gonna. So this episode may as well be an entire Convince Me segment, where I convince Andrei that Final Fantasy VIII is in fact the best Final Fantasy. When we picked the games that we were going to talk about, we'd planned to both pick games. We had to have some kind of consensus that we both had a lot of positive things to say about them. But in full disclosure, I fought pretty hard to have this one on this list because for me, it is unabashedly my favorite Final Fantasy, or at the very least, it's tied for my favorite Final Fantasy, which I don't think is a widely held opinion. What do you think about that?
Now, to be fair, I don't want listeners to feel like I despise this game. I, for the most part, love every Final Fantasy, but this is in the bottom half for me. Like, I haven't done a ranking of them, of which one's the worst to the best. Maybe we do a Hall of Fame at some point, but it's nowhere near like my top 5 in the series for sure.
Yeah, of numbered Final Fantasies, this is my tied for one, if not number one, Final Fantasy. Tied with 6, but you know that's a thing to get into later. A little bit of background on this before we really get into it. Final Fantasy VIII, the game released in North America in September of 1999. This is 2 years after Final Fantasy VII, which was, if you weren't around for it, watershed moment for gaming. PlayStation was super new. It marked a huge graphical shift upwards for JRPGs specifically, and really changed the way we thought about cutscenes in video games. We thought about storytelling in video games, and this is coming 2 years after that. It's also a year and a half after Final Fantasy Tactics, which I do not count in the discussion of the greatest Final Fantasies because it would win. And it's not a numbered entry. It's its own thing. It lives in its own Hall of Fame for me. Final Fantasy VIII comes out in the same month as Tony Hawk's Pro Skater. Did you know that?
I did not. Wow, that really warps my scale of time because I feel like Final Fantasy VIII is like profoundly in my childhood, and Tony Hawk is like in my early high school years.
Yeah, no, this is coming around the same time. Which, I mean, Tony Hawk, a game that hogged the gaming airwaves, but if you're really living in the JRPG world, as many players were at that time, especially folks who had a PlayStation and were like, this is what we do, you had, up until this point, a pretty short list of games that were readily available to you, some of which were quite good, but were often more in an animated, cartoony style, and not living up to the blockbuster status that Final Fantasy had already achieved by this point. Even in North America, the holiday season advertising for Final Fantasy VI, years before this game, had kind of cemented Final Fantasy as this blockbuster game moment for players who were invested in gaming. Would you agree?
It's interesting because I feel like people's investment with this franchise was already really high at the time, but I feel like every game is so different from one from the other, aside from game systems, that I know a lot of people in my school who had been riding on the high of 7 and waiting for this, and then like this did not land. But I know people who came to the franchise with this game and find the rest of the franchise to be inadequate relative to how they feel about this one. Yeah, so well, it's kind of a weird situation. So
I'm going to contextualize where did this game fall for folks who weren't just playing Final Fantasy VII and then were waiting for Final Fantasy VIII, but like, what were the JRPGs in circulation at the time of this game's release, to give some context? Because this is the this was my house, right? This is where I lived as a player. And so I wasn't just playing Final Fantasy, I was playing a lot of stuff. So a few of the games that came out on PlayStation for this time, Brave Fencer Musashi, one of those games, which is more of an action adventure style game, kind of cartoony. It's a top-down-ish Zelda-like, is made by Squaresoft and was one of the games that was advertised on the back of instruction books from Square Games at that time. Jade Cocoon, a monster collecting RPG that I mentioned briefly on the Pokemon podcast, that had an interesting style, but didn't take off. A game called Legend of Legaia, which was a very janky game about a world-consuming mist. Did you play Legends of Legaia, Andrei?
I did, and I love this game, but I have weird.
I'm with
JRPG
you, okay?
stories.
No, this game was rough, but it was one of the few games that you could get, and you could get it cheaply, right? It's slightly above Mystic Quest 64 in quality, I would say, but it has heart. There's a lot of heart to this game, and I think is like, I don't know, someone maybe making their first D&D campaign kind of story. It has a lot of charm in the way it was developed, but not a lot of polish. I think we'll put it that way. Another one was a Lunar Silver Star Story Complete. Just had its big re-release on PlayStation. It was a Sega CD game before that, I think. And I mean, listen, while Lunar was a great game, it lacked the heft of a Final Fantasy, especially if you followed the hype going into the Lunar re-release. Like, it was over every magazine, game shows were talking about Lunar, Lunar, Lunar. It's this big moment. It was marketed as like the second coming of the JRPG, right? And really, Lunar's about a 20 to 30 hour experience all told. And it feels like it ends in the middle of a story. And, while I loved my time playing the game, I was like, oh, I really wish this was actually more of a thing. And the first Wild Arms was out at the time, which is, I would put in the Legend of Legaia genre, which is charming and polish lacking, where you're kind of this chibi Wild West gunslinging crew. And it's very, very traditional turn-based style combat, not reinventing the wheel at all. And both Suikoden 1 and 2 were technically out at this time, but both of them, especially Suikoden 2, was really hard to get a copy of, at least in Canada. I don't think they ever printed enough of these to meet demand, and you always had to go through really expensive secondary markets to get a copy of this game. And I was really lucky because I ended up in my local EB Games when they just got a used copy of this in store, and I bought it right away. But that's pretty much the landscape at that time, right? Which is some good games, a lot of middling games, and pretty rough games, whether they had charm or not. Any other thoughts before we move into the depths of this?
No, I think you've said it pretty much in terms of, like, there are other JRPGs we can slot in here. So
I'm going to talk about one more. Don't worry.
But I do feel like you're right that we kept getting a hype cycle of like this game is going to save the JRPG, and like none of them really did. None of them failed. None of them were terrible and unplayable. But I think it took a very long time before we got a game that was like transcendent of genre and was just emblematic of like high level AAA blockbuster JRPG game design, which probably I'm curious to hear your case. In my mind, that's probably Final Fantasy X, which is not one of my favorites, but I feel like was everywhere around me when I was in high school.
Yeah, I think 10 is definitely in the running, but that's another generation. That's right. The next step, right? That's a PS2 really elevation, and I think the thing we're getting to is like, which game does the Final Fantasy VI thing where it's like, this is going to be the best version of the Super Nintendo era JRPG game, right? Where Final Fantasy VII for the PlayStation is like, we're setting the new standard with this new technology, but who's going to make use of this the best, right?
Right.
And 10 is now doing that for the PlayStation 2, if we're getting all the way to 10. So there is this middle space that has all these different contenders. And when you're talking about like that genre transcending thing, there was one contender that to me is actually a spiritual predecessor to Final Fantasy VIII, which is, I don't know if you know what I'm going to say, but it's Parasite Eve.
Oh, that wasn't what I thought you were going to say.
Yeah, so my argument for this is it has the promise of merging like the graphical potential that we saw with Final Fantasy VII, you know, this RPG framing, the way the game is played, and that more realistic rather than stylized graphical aesthetic that we get in Final Fantasy VIII. Is this game is already doing that, right? It's also pushing the genre boundaries of being a Squaresoft inflected RPG version of Resident Evil, right? And the game was not perfect, and I think this game has been a little lost to time, but there's a very clear through line you can see from Final Fantasy VII to trying to grow those basic ideas of the little chibi characters into fully formed, more lifelike looking avatars in Parasite Eve, to what happens when you finally get Final Fantasy VIII. And also, you know, kind of in relation to talking about Diablo that we did last time on the podcast, bringing back the Final Fantasy color, the Final Fantasy aesthetic, which Parasite Eve didn't have. It was very dark, it was very gloomy, it was very grim, right? And that's not maybe the best use to debut this kind of new style for your RPG or publishing brand, right?
Right.
And then September 1999, Final Fantasy VIII comes out, and I think at the time especially, they aimed pretty high for what the game could be, right? They tried to produce these more realistic looking characters, and it marketed super well as a next step in gaming. It was also released I'm not sure if it was simultaneous or if it was very shortly after on PC at around the same time as coming out for PlayStation. And it was,
I think it was a bit later.
It was a bit later. I wasn't sure. I couldn't triangulate the dates there. But it was the fastest selling Final Fantasy until 13. It's like the hype going into this thing was real, right? You have to remember that this was like, we were clamoring for it. It was probably going to be the only RPG game other than Final Fantasy VII folks who weren't invested in RPGs as a genre were going to play. And for the JRPG players, it was just a given that we were going to buy this, right? But since that time, as Andrei has established, there's a lot of folks who just really didn't gel with this game as a product. And in every situation where I have been, where Final Fantasy comes up as a topic of conversation, most folks don't remember this game at all. A couple folks will actively hate it if it's mentioned. And there's always two people, myself and one other person who is in any number of these groups whenever this game comes up, that will proudly declare this as the best game in the franchise in rapid defense of it. And I'm here to represent us today. The two people who are like, yeah, this is the best one. But before we get into it, I think we're going to start where we came to this game and a couple memories that we have for it. And then I will make my case to, to Andrei and all of you listening in long form essay about what makes this the best Final Fantasy for me. But before we do that, Andrei, what was your inroads into Final Fantasy VIII?
So this is maybe one of the most unhinged stories of my life. My contact with Final Fantasy happens in two waves. Once when it came out, and then another part many years later. So this game came out in 1999, but I didn't get a chance to play it the year it came out. I think I actually played it much closer to 2000. I know this because I was in 6th grade at the time, and one fall evening, I was dealing with a group of bullies at my school, and I remember very clearly borrowing dictionaries from the school library to fill my backpack and turn it into a flail so I could fight multiple people at the same time. which I knew was going to be happening to me at 4:30. And as this, presumed fight began to unfold at 4:30, a 15-year-old boy approached the group and kind of kicked the crap out of my bullies. And this kid's name was William, and his little brother was my age, and he showed up, and his name was Chris, and that's when I met them. And they beat the shit out of these bullies, and then they were like, "Hey, man, do you want to come over to our place? We'll have grilled cheeses and play Final Fantasy." And that's the first day I played Final Fantasy VIII, which was sort of we're watching the older brother play it, and we're sometimes getting the controller. Now, I didn't know these people that well, given I just met them, so this was a bit weird, and they lived right in front of my grade school. But when I told my family about this, my cousin, who was 15 at the time, indicated to me that she knew William from school and that he was really hot. And so I had to keep going over to his place to sort of like build rapport so that she could then insinuate herself into the friend group and he would ask her out. So I was acting like a Trojan horse for my teenage cousin's dating life via Final Fantasy VIII. Unfortunately, I didn't get to play Final Fantasy VIII in full at that time. I only got to see about the first 2 CDs. And then I came to it much later in life as an adult, and it was fine, but I think I probably played it way after sort of the moment when it would have been a really exciting technological development, and that probably colors my appreciation of the game.
Yeah, I think maybe not only the technological aspect, which is, but by the way, before we get into that, that story is fucking incredible and completely on brand for Final Fantasy VIII, given that it starts with 2 high school kids battling it out on a fucking mountain and ends with love. Your story really actually just encapsulates the story of Final Fantasy VIII in its own.
Unfortunately, it didn't end in love for my cousin.
It didn't end in love for your cousin. Well, it tried to be. I guess this is the alternate ending where instead of being saved by a protagonist on a giant ship out in space, the Renoa that is your cousin actually just froze to death in the void. But we don't have to. Moving on. How did I come to this? I also came to this game. Well, not in high school, but actually my fondest memories of this game are actually in high school. I played it when it came out in 1999, which I would have been in grade 8, which is a year before high school, in where I went to school in Canada. And I played it, and I loved it. I think I was too young to explain really why I loved it. But then 2 years later, when I was in grade 10, which is in high school, in Mr. Bontron's business class, me and my friend group of nerds were passing around a copy of Final Fantasy VIII because I had sold my copy to get new games, as you had to do as a student who didn't have a job to play new games. I gave away my 1999 copy of Final Fantasy VIII, or sold it rather, for probably $10 to EB Games so I could get some store credit. But then in grade 10, this game was being passed around our class, and I asked if I could take it home, and I played it again in high school, right at grade 10, from start to finish. And I think this is who the game is for. I think this is for a grade 10. And I think it might even be for a grade 10 who has played the game once before already, because I think it lets you absorb what this game is actually doing and what it's supposed to be about, and like all the things that are most heightened in your life at that moment are so aligned with what this game is trying to tell you about, I think. And I think that's why it works and why I think about it so fondly. Although I went back and played a little bit of it before we did this podcast, and honestly, I think those themes still hold up, but nostalgia does a lot of work for this stuff. So are there any last comments before I get into why I think this is absolutely the best Final Fantasy?
I'm just ready to hear your case.
All right.
Because you've been advocating for this game basically from the first day that we met, when you were asked to draw on a sheet of paper in like circles, talking about like we would have to draw these diagrams of which games were most influential, and your Final Fantasy VIII circle was like 2/3 of the page.
Well, actually, my the circle was Final Fantasy VII, because when I was living in Japan, I talked to a bunch of people who were living there about what is their most formative game experience, and they all cited Final Fantasy VII. And on that sheet, I circled Final Fantasy VII. But what you're remembering is when that thing was huge, and I said, "But just to be clear, this isn't for me. Final Fantasy VIII is the best one." So that's yeah, but no, what an interesting exercise, and you should do that exercise at home actually, if you want to get a sense of like what is your your gaming family tree, and why is it that you like certain games. It's actually a really cool exercise to reflect on who you are as a player. Okay, so I have a few points here. Really, I think five points. One of them is a sub point that I'm going to convey to you. And I think just let me get through them. And at the end of this, I think we'll maybe do but what about, and you can bring up anything from this game that you have some critiques of, and I will do my best to defend the indefensible, because that is always a fun exercise. Agreed? Agreed. Okay, so point one, what is this game about? Not what is the plot, but what is this game trying to say to you? What is encoded in this game? And in some way, this is a discussion about what the franchise is trying to say. Like, a lot of the Final Fantasies generally, I think, are honestly about the same thing at the core of them. And if you put all the things that Final Fantasy VIII is about together, I think it meets the franchise's thematic goals in the best way of all the Final Fantasy games since the SNES era. Holistically, there might be some scenes I like better in recent Final Fantasies, but I think as an overall package, this is like the best goal. So what is the Final Fantasy franchise, and what is this game about? One, it's about young people being forced to fight wars that aren't theirs with very little say or autonomy, right? If you want to read it more allegorically, it's about conforming to the legacy of one society without the ability to choose what your life can be like and what you can do in those parameters, right? You have some duty to some externally prescribed purpose. We've seen a lot of, as in the case with Final Fantasy VII, Final Fantasy IV, we've seen a lot of soldiers, war heroes, generic fantasy protagonists, even within the Final Fantasy franchise. But this game works better because they are kids in a school, a place that most of us as people have all had to go, a place where we do not have that autonomy and we have expectations loaded upon us constantly. We don't all serve in the military. We aren't all super soldier experiments, but we are all at some point kids. And I think we can relate to the power dynamics that this game is trying to impress upon us, right? This is what it looks like for most of us on our planet Earth, and we go with these students as they're interpolated into their society, as they are secretly being taught to be war machines, although it's not that secret given that they have, swords and such. But the conceit is that they don't quite fully know their warful purpose as they are doing exams. Like, remember, you start this game by taking an exam, right? It's one of the first things you do after you wake up from your CGI fight on the beach, right? So this is one of those contexts, one of the things that this game is about. Two, what is the Final Fantasy franchise about? It's about love, friendship, and fellowship, right? And how that these aspects are sacrificed or lost in service of the greater duty in point one. And the love story between Squall and Renoa and between Laguna and Rain in this game show you two different kinds of love and loss and friendship between the kids from the orphanage, between these couples that happen as you are trying to live up to the expectations of one's duty in society, right? It leans a little bit into fate, but I think it's showing you that you can have bonds with people you wouldn't even imagine possible, that you can develop these kinds of loves and friendships in the little cracks that form in the spaces between your duty, right? And then by the end of this, again, another theme in Final Fantasy, every time you get to the end is what are you doing it for? Why are you going to the moon to kill this evil? Like, what? It has to be for something, right? And for all these characters, for Laguna, for Squall, for Rinoa, it's about fighting back to get the moments, the people where love is. You're fighting to at least create a space where you can have that kind of feeling in the wake of a momentous, oppressive dedication to duty impressed upon you by other people, right? And so it's the place where you felt alive outside of whatever duty was prescribed for you. And that's where the game ends. The game ends in a field out of context where people are just, they fought, and they fought for what? That one space, that one memory where it all mattered for something. And in my mind, from point A to point Z of this game, it gets through all those themes far better than any other game in the Final Fantasy franchise. And that is my point 1 of Final Fantasy. Would you like to jump in briefly before I move on to point 2?
Well, what kind of jump am I allowed to make here? What are the rules?
Let's do a tiny intervention and just let me make my case. But if you would like a small interjection into this, please.
I think I'm going to hold it for a bit later, at least for this, because this I feel is a wider discussion about like the themes and the commitments of this game, which I don't want to.
But that's point 1, and that's where the themes are going to go, and we can litigate all those points in a moment. Point 2 of this: the first disc of this game is solid gold, and I think if you stop this game at the end of disc 1, you would have played what is probably the best opening, long form, like 8 to 10 hour chunk of the Final Fantasy series. From, you get to see a cutscene where a ominous chorus is singing behind you, and you are fighting your rival on a beach. You take an entrance exam. You go punch a T-Rex to graduate. You what do? You go collect a giant Pokemon that you bind yourself to and get your power from. You go on a spy mission and a crazy train ride, and you go try to do an assassination attempt. Like, this is some James Bond, Indiana Jones shit in the best way. But also it has, you know, if we're being contemporary, that Stranger Things School Days vibe to it as well. And I will fully admit, and I will concede this point here, that the game becomes unmoored after the first disc. But that first disc, from recruiting all your allies to being sent on that you know it's going to fail. You know that mission to assassinate the sorceress Edea is going to fail. But it's going along with that failed prospect, and this kind of supports that duty, right? You didn't know that mission was going to fail? You were like, you're definitely going to kill her here? Convinced. You were convinced?
I thought, yeah, 100%.
But maybe this is the magic of that second playthrough that I did within those like 3 years, right? Where it's like, I'm sure in grade 8, I didn't know that mission was going to fail. Now, at the end of disc 1, I'm like, you're clearly not going to kill this lady right here. This is clearly all orchestrated to build you up, to make you believe that you are capable to do this. But if you go with, you know, the way the plot has to work, there's 3 more discs in this game. Clearly you don't succeed here. But I actually think if the game ends there, it's actually still in the running for one of the best games for a different reason. And that reason is my point 3 here, which is a conspiracy theory that I came to much later in life, but then retroactively reread the game this way and was like, I don't believe this is true, or the artistic vision behind this game. I think it's a very optimistic reading, especially maybe for people who didn't really like where the game goes after disc 1. But the theory is called Squall is Dead. And at the end of disc 1, the closing moments of disc 1 of this game, you go to try and assassinate the sorceress, who is theoretically the source of all ills and evil on the planet, although you realize later in the story that is not the case. So you, as these students in this institution that are actually creating super soldiers, effectively. You are sent on this mission to assassinate this person, and you fail. You, for various reasons, cannot get it done. And the protagonist of this story is a la Tuxedo Mask, shot through the chest with a conjured icicle. And then they tumble to their death, fade to black. You don't know what happens. Now, in the regular course of playing this game, the thing that happens is that you wake up. Well, first you have a dream sequence, and then you wake up in a prison, right? And then you go on a prison break, which is like more James Bond shit, right? Come on. But actually, there's another read, because the game after that, the game's already weird, but after that moment, the game gets even stranger, right? I'm not going to go through all the ways the game gets weird, but I think this is where the game loses most people, is after disc 1 or in some moments after that disc, whether it's far later in the play. Was this the case for you?
Well, so actually, I find that disc 1 had the hardest time holding me, and it was kind of a slog. And I really like disc 2, and then after that, I'm kind of like, wow, we're really on a carpet ride here.
Well, okay, so let's get back to this after in a second, because I would just want to get back to Squall is Dead here. The idea being that if you play through the game with the idea that Squall has been killed at the end of disc 1, you're actually experiencing his purgatory life. And all the strange occurrences that happen are him coming to terms with all the things that he was told he has to do, all the expectations that were impressed upon him, and in his final moments as his consciousness leaves, the things that he realized were important, which is the end cutscene of the game, were the connections with his father that he never actually got to meet or know, the connections with Renoa, which in the course of this game is actually very fleeting if he does die at the end of disc 1. And it's just this kind of reflection of like, don't squander the time that you have, right? Which I think is a very nice sentiment, whether you read this game either way. Point 4 is, and this is super subjective, but I'm going to stand my ground here. This game has the best combo in any of the Final Fantasies up to this point, and I would with confidence say up at least until Final Fantasy X, of cutscenes and music used together. I think the opening cutscene of this game sets the bar really high, but you also have scenes where the boats are going and storming the beach on the first mission that the students have. You have the scenes in the very French-inspired city where the assassination attempts take place under the Arc de Triomphe in that city. Like, these are gorgeous, and the music is used impeccably in these. And Final Fantasy VII was revolutionary, and those cutscenes are cool. But man, the cutscenes in this game are really something else. May I continue?
You can continue. I'm currently litigating in my mind the case for these points. So what's point 5, Mark?
Well, I'm
this all leading
to? Point 4.5 on this. Eyes on Me. The single song Eyes on Me, which is, I believe, the first Final Fantasy song, if you don't count like the opera in 6, to actually have like lyrics in it being played during the game. I can't remember this in Final Fantasy VII. So if this happened in 7, clearly it didn't leave an impact on me. But this is an actual song sung by a human being. It feels like a sad ballad pop track. And it is very melancholic and bittersweet. And I think is just, it elevates the game as a whole that this exists in it. Like, it's a thing that myself and another colleague, we sing this song at karaoke. Like, this has stuck with us our whole lives in a way that you can't do this with other Final Fantasy games, right? There's something tangible and memorable in the lyrics that you're actually taking with you. And for me, you know, I'm an ear person. I'm an audio guy. That's how I learn. That's how I absorb things. It's through my ears more than my eyes. And I think this just made such beautiful use of the music. And that one track in particular was amazing. And my last point is this. I actually have 2 final points. Point 5. I know a lot of people hated the two timelines that happened in this game, including myself. I actually didn't like this in the game, and I kind of still don't, but I think they're there for a reason. Where you go between Laguna, who is actually Squall's dad, but you never actually told that in the game, but it's fairly obvious, and Squall as the two protagonists, and you constantly cut between the two. But now, as an older human, having watched a lot more movies, having consumed a lot more media, I fully understand that this is Final Fantasy's version of the Godfather 2 split-cutting plotline. And Squall's story and him falling in love and going through all these struggles that his dad also went through in a different way, in a different time. It was generational. It wasn't the same war. They weren't the same loves, but it's a recreation with slight differences between these two people, and seeing how they are mediating their own worlds and their own loves and friendships in relation to duty. That is so central to what this story is trying to tell you, and how it's trying to tell you these things. And I think maybe they reached a bit beyond what we were ready for in doing this. And I fully admit I was not on board. And then my honorary point, which is not going to be 0.6, but it is point important. This game has some of the weirdest shit in it in any Final Fantasy, which is made all the weirder by how the proportions of the bodies are more normal than they've ever been in any Final Fantasy up to this point, how realistic compared to the other Final Fantasies this game has looked. This game has absolutely it has madness. It has things like Renoa shooting her dog as a gun. It has things like the dean of your school, Balnam Garden, is a floppy alien-handed guy with a giant scrotum as a chin. Like, this game, the Final Fantasy monster naming conventions take a break for most of this game. And there are just things like Thrustavis and Bull in the game. All right? Like, that alone, to me, is a level of quirk that sets this game outside of the average. And not in a way that is bad. It makes it, to me, remarkable. And all these things combined are, for me, why I believe this game is incredible. And I am completely willing to take comments or questions from the panel.
So I think it would be useful, now that we're at the end of this, to sort of do a bullet point recap of your 5 points. Right?
Yes.
So we categorize them. So point 1 has to do with the. Oh, I'm trying to remember. So
I will do it for you here. On what the Final Fantasy franchise has been about, I think this game is getting to those core themes the best out of all of them. That is my point 1.
Point 2?
Point 2, I think the first disc of this game is solid gold. For me, It is the best single disc sequence of a Final Fantasy. 3, Squall is Dead provides an alternate reading of this game that makes the back half of this game enjoyable either as it was written or as you interpret it through this strange conspiracy theory.
Now, I will concede that point 3 speaks to me on a conspiracy theorist level, which I'm not super happy about.
Well,
from myself, but what can you do?
That's the way we distill media through our bodies. This game has the best cutscenes, and I don't mean just the visuals. I mean the use of audio visual in cutscene. Like, certainly up until this point, I think there are arguments to be made that once the technology gets better, obviously, like in 10. They're clearly, but up until this point, and I still think if they updated all of these cutscenes and you gave them the Final Fantasy XV treatment, and they were running that graphics engine as works of art, these are the best. Eyes on Me, an incredible song that really elevated the emotional stakes of the game, and the split timelines is a JRPG attempt at doing the Godfather 2. Now,
okay,
that's it. And then point 6, the weird shit.
All right. So I will say, before we get started on this hearing of the Final Fantasy VIII is best game case, you've made a very compelling argument that I think is incredibly well researched and well grounded. And I think actually our disagreements and why I rate it lower aren't categorically different. It's just that there are things that I personally don't jive with, which conversely, I would argue is why the ones that appeal to me the most are not the games that appeal to you the most. And so I want to bracket that. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to bracket point 3, which is the alternate reading of this game, which I think is really neat and not really something that's shared by most other Square Enix products. I think you can only make that case for Kingdom Hearts to an extent, that it might all be a fantasy, or like the person might be having this in dreams. Like I don't want to litigate that too much, because I think that's just like a neat way to revisit the game with a different framework. Eyes on Me, I think, is kind of an unimpeachable argument. I think it sets the stage for a lot of Final Fantasy X2, which has a similar relationship to music, with
which is also a game that's high on my list.
And it has the singing sequel, which was broadcast on network television ads prior to the game launching. That's how my parents learned about Final Fantasy,
right?
And thought that it was going to be like amazing. So Final Fantasy VIII does have that first appeal. I think you are correct that 7 only has the Sephiroth, the One-Winged Angel, and Genova songs as maybe the only things that have vocals in them, but they're more like Gregorian chant than they are actual lyrics.
Yeah.
So I think all these points are really solid. Now, I think what happens and why I experience it differently, and there are some negative points that I'll talk about afterwards, is Disc 1 being solid gold, and this game getting at the franchise's themes best out of all of the games.
Okay.
And I think I can't argue against your perception of that. I will just say this. For listeners of this podcast who maybe haven't played this, Disc 1 has a lot to do with sort of being a teenager in a military science fiction school that has kind of slice of life elements in it, which I really just don't like.
Yeah.
Period. And I think that's not an indictment of the game. I think the reason why I like things like Tactics Ogre and Final Fantasy IX and 12, and quite frankly, I'm pretty sure I'm going to love 16 from the look of it, is because I enjoy Final Fantasies that root their story in middle-aged, disgraced soldiers in humanitarian conflicts.
And also the larger than life setting, the fantastical setting as well, where it's understanding the two of us as media consumers. I, especially as I've gotten older, although I think I've always had a bit of an appreciation for this, I like things that are grounded in, like, the school setting is familiar. It feels real. And it's worth talking about. In Persona 5 as well, you found the same problem of, like, it's hard to relate to the setting, right?
I immediately disconnected.
Yeah.
From it. Personally, it does nothing for me. And again, not an indictment of the game, but I think it is a formative aspect of why, for example, myself and our PhD supervisor tend to prefer 9 to 8 if in like close comparison. Like that game speaks a lot more to us. The other part of this, which I think is inherent in this sort of school context, is Final Fantasy VIII is something that we would classify as maybe cyberpunk or near future, like in aesthetic. It is very, like, there are some dark and grimy parts, but mostly it's got contemporary technology. It's got guns.
It's like a steampunk cyberpunk hybrid.
Yeah, where I would argue, so now there are starting to be a lot more differentiations, and the aesthetic that 9 has is something that's often qualified as solar punk, which is like almost agrarian style technology. So it's like at most feudal era, and actually in a lot of cases pre-feudal and very like low tech. So these are all aesthetic choices, right? What I'm saying is, like, I just don't. There's a level at which I just don't connect to the characters in the story. And I think that, like, kind of that's why I prefer disc 2 to disc 1, because disc 2 is very out of the school. At that point, you are in a different frame. And disc 3, I mean, there are some narrative plot points, but if I were to rank them, and 4 is kind of like the finale, so I don't want to rank it. It kind of goes like 2, 3, 1 for me, where I think it would probably go like 1, 2, 3 for you, or something like that. You know, the other aspect is it's partly housed in this description that I've done is the values that are core to the franchise. I think there are two competing core threads throughout Final Fantasy, and we tend to get them in alternating segments, right? So this one's a lot about coming of age and finding your place in the world and who am I. So it's very much like the German like coming of age story. It's the Bildungsroman, right? Yep. It's like that part where that's present in 10 also, and it is kind of present in 9. However, if you look at things like the games that I like 12 and Tactics and Ogre Battle, that's not what it is. Those are stories about higher order mythology and like how are nations built? How do countries behave against each other, which is the other aspect of Final Fantasy. And these two threads are present in every game. It's just that I think certain games rely more on one or the other. So sort of like less about the interpersonal relationships and more about, you know, the political or magical or scientific systems that run through these games. So it really is like, are we playing these games to relate to the characters, or are we playing these games to explore the world that they're in primarily?
Yeah.
And I think I play them for the world. Like when I played 15, which we both liked, we liked it for almost opposite reasons.
Yeah, totally.
Where you liked it because it was about the core crew and their relationships to each other, and I was like, I get to see the cool gods and how massive they are and how like the world revolves around them.
Yeah, and I do just want to put a little mid interrogation caveat here is I hold most of these games fairly highly. Like just to be clear, and especially Final Fantasy Tactics, as we're talking about, I like it, and I like it for a lot of the same reasons you do. I just think it also probably does a better job at that slice of what Final Fantasy is about than any of the mainline entries do. Correct. And so if I need a favorite that kind of Final Fantasy, it's Tactics. And if I need a favorite this kind of Final Fantasy, it's 8. Right.
I think one of the really interesting ones that I don't know if we've ever talked about at great length is 12, because 12 has like this very strange development history where Yasumi Matsuno, the director of Tactics Ogre and Ogre Battle March of the Black Queen, starts out as director and starts building it as one of these games. Actually, 12 is set in the same world as Tactics and Ivalice, but in a different country. And it is about like imperialism and how it feels to be subjugated by another country and to live in that world. And it has a lot of stuff about workers' rights and mining and like succession and deism and like the nature of faith in the world. And then it switches about halfway through production. Matsuno left due to presumably burnout, but also creative disagreements with higher ups at Square Enix, who wanted the game to be more appealing to Japanese teenagers. And so they asked for, quote, something more like an Akihabara vibe. And so they got Kawazu, who was the director of Final Fantasy II, to design Vaughn and Penelo as the core perspective characters. Originally, the main character was supposed to be the 45-year-old disgraced captain whose entire battalion died.
Yeah.
But when you get the game, it's actually shipped to be about urban youths and them navigating the world, which I think is closer to that like very relatable ground floor vibe. And so that game is actually like two different games smashed together, and at certain points it feels like more one or the other, and that's like a weird test case. I don't know, do you feel like I'm wrong about like these two competing sort of visions for what the franchise is that are
no, absolutely not. And like, to be honest, as part of the rhetorical exercise of making an argument about something, I think Final Fantasy is actually about a lot more than what I said it's about. I also think there's some strong environmental threads a la, you know, Ghibli discourse and how that inflects in Final Fantasy as well, that is present in all these games too. And this might not be the game where that is the strongest. I think it's quite strong in 9 actually. And that game probably does that the best. But
7-2, I guess.
7 as well. No, 7 is absolutely 7 as well.
Yeah,
quite a few of them. But no, I think there are several different competing threads in these, and I think the actual thing is like, I think 8 is unique among the bunch, and that's probably what makes it so special to me, is that there isn't really another game in the franchise that is like this, where 9 has similar vibes to the early Nintendo and Super Nintendo versions of the game. 7 you see aesthetically repeated again in 10. You see it aesthetically repeated in 15, right? Like, they share this kind of language, and 8 really is, aside from maybe in some of the technological elements of the game and mixing with Final Fantasy VI a little bit, which is my other favorite of the mainline games, you don't really see what it gives you too much, or the way it's engaging with those themes. Usually it is the thing you're talking about. And again, I think the franchise does them all pretty well. Yeah.
So I would agree with you that it is the most unique out of the 16 installments. It is the one that is most unlike the rest, followed by maybe, if we're not counting the MMO installments like 14 and 11, we're not really placing here, because those are, I think, thematically very commensurate with the series, but mechanically very different, obviously. I think 12 is the other one that is just like extremely weird. Mechanically, thematically, in terms of like, it's in the future, but in the past, the themes are weird and wonky. Like, that game is less unique than 8, I think. It does have some commonalities with 1 or 2 other installments, but outside of that, it is the weirdest. So what I'm gonna target my final sort of like, I just don't jive with this comment, and then I'm gonna move into my critique, because there are things that I think are actively not great in the game, but that's a me thing. So the last thing, which I think is, I've located now as your point 6, is this game is weird and funky compared to the rest of the franchise, which to me, that is part of the enjoyment, is every time I turn on a Final Fantasy, is how does Ifrit look in this one?
Yeah.
How does this monster look like? How does the Quirrell, which is sort of like their long like whiskered panther, appear in this game compared to the other ones? And that's part of the, effectively, like, I don't come to these games that particularly excited about the main characters initially. I'm excited about the recurring motifs between the last 14 of them, and seeing my favorite summon appear in a new way. Presumably 16 is going to be like catnip for me, because they're the main characters of the story. Like, they sort of merge the two, where the main characters are the mythology. So we'll see how that shakes out. But I think part of why you like 8 is because it breaks from that, and part of why I don't like it is because I have less of an attachment to summons like Quetzalcoatl or Doom Train than I do to series staples like Ramu, who is not in 8, if I remember.
Yeah, but I hear what you're saying, but let me counterpoint with this. One of the summons unique to this game are 2 brothers of Minotaur-looking dudes that play a game of rock, paper, scissors, and the loser gets thrown up into the sky to break a giant rock.
No, okay. I'm not saying they're not good. I'm just saying, like, I'm locating that that's actually like an axis where I was a bit weirded out by this. And I was thinking about this in regards to 12, because 12 does the same thing. 12 actually has like a completely different suite of summons as well.
Yeah.
With like maybe 1 or 2 exceptions of things that came back.
I'm totally here with you, and I do have to say, like, this is a game about this is a podcast where we talk about our formative memories about these games, and I have one for Final Fantasy, and when I played it for the first time in grade 8, which is when I got Quetzalcoatl, and I was like, why? Right? And I still remember that, and I still have that, and I fully agree. And I think I'm going to agree with a couple more of your critiques of the game as we get to them.
All right, so maybe we can move into that part, which is,
let's do it.
And I want to preface this by saying, I'm arriving at this game with the spirit of generosity. We don't want to kill anything on the show if we can afford it. But I think there are aspects of this game which lessened my enjoyment with it at a formative stage, which I can now talk about.
Yeah.
One that I think you generally agree with, and I think it just doesn't bother you as much as it does me, is the game's magic system really decreases my enjoyment of the gameplay.
Totally.
So the way that magic works in most of these is you go to a shopkeeper, or through some kind of item you gain a new level of spell, and usually they have like Pokemon style evolutions. So you get fire, then Fira or Fyra, and then Firaga, which is like the third one, and you're like, great, I've found these. And I can use them forever so long as I have magic points or mana or whatever system is active in the game. Now, 8 is kind of notorious for having the draw stock system, which no other game in this series has as far as I know.
Yeah.
And the idea is, if you want a specific spell, you have to draw it from monsters, which means you have to kind of go find them in the world, draw magic from them, and then you get you can stock it or you can use it live, but you get a limited number of uses. So it's like you're running out of batteries with certain magic that you need to go find again. Some magic is extremely rare. I think one of the really difficult to find ones in the original game was Meltdown, which I think is only like 2 overworld locations. They have no reason to go look for it there.
Yeah.
And so I find that introduced sort of padding to the game, where like you had to go find stuff that I think if I just had a regular magical system in this, I would have felt better about it.
No,
I'm
going to jump in briefly here. I totally agree with you. And I think, I'm not sure if it was deliberate, but one thing that I noticed going back through is that Final Fantasy VIII is actually plot-wise very short. And I think you can get through the game in like 30 hours of casual playing if you aren't really invested in stocking up. And this is one of the things I want to point out here really quick, though, is that when I played this game, I have a younger sister who's much younger than me who played this game a few years later. And my mother also played around the same time as I played this the first time. And all three of us, I don't know why we all did it this way in the various times we played this game, always stocked to 99. Like we always stocked to our max stock value. And would always replenish it back up to full to make sure we never ran out of shit you would never cast. It's just, you needed it. We needed to have it all. But I think where this was frustrating for a lot of players, I think, especially for my mom, I don't know how my sister felt, but like for my mom, that was a really satisfying way of playing the game. Like it was a collection game that was pleasant, right? Which I didn't have. I'm not a huge fan of this system, but it also didn't bother me at the time. If I went back to actually do a full playthrough of this game right now, would I do it? Absolutely not.
Right. I also think that the draw stock system feeds into some of the gameplay loops that are, once you know about them, especially when you're a teenager, and you're not like actively giving yourself a challenge and you're saying, well, I'm just going to use the thing that seems really good. There's a spell that I think once you know to draw it and stock it, it is like the thing that you go find the most, and it becomes like overpowering to the storyline, which is the aura spell.
Okay.
Which effectively gives everyone limit breaks constantly. And one of the characters, Manoa, has a limit break that makes everyone invincible. And that's the game. The game is no longer fighting and finding out mechanics. It's just making everyone permanently invincible, even if the fights take a bit slower. I found in combination, like this overarching, I want to say like the mechanical configuration of magic and limits in this game kind of broke down the experience of play, which I found to be simpler and more satisfying in 9, where instead of collecting magic, you're collecting items, which when you equip will give you those abilities over time. And so there's a collection. The collection's offloaded into a different part of the game.
Yeah.
that is less micromanagey. 12 also has a similar complaint, I think, where it's like you have to find the gambits to make your AI better. And so I think this aspect is like, again, for some people, I think it doesn't matter at all. I think for some people, especially if you're like speedrunning this game, you probably are having a really interesting experience where you have to measure your time commitment to finding and drawing out the correct kinds of magic versus like completing it, which that's an interesting outcrop that I don't think other games can really produce in the series.
Yeah.
But I just really don't enjoy it. Like that's neat. It doesn't work for me.
No, didn't work for me either. But I think that's another interesting thing here about, like, for me, clearly the Final Fantasy franchise is not a franchise that I play for its mechanics. And so they can make a lot of mechanical faux pas, and I just don't care.
Fair.
But it's weird because in other games, I am a mechanic stickler. But it's just, I don't know, maybe it's just because different time of my life, and now I just associate this franchise with, like, I don't really care if they're, doing something good here.
Yeah. Okay, I have my point 2, and this actually you might not have anything with, or it might be even one of your positive points. So I'm gonna ask about this.
Do it.
Summon boosting or Guardian Force boosting.
Yeah.
So summons are usually like the magical spirits. You described it as a Pokemon that you collect. So it's like Ifrit or Shiva or whatever, and you pair them with a character in this game, and so you can only have one active per party member at one time. And when you use it, there was a system called Boost where you would have to repeatedly press the X button as fast as you could to multiply the power of your Guardian Force. Now, this sounds really dope because you can like mash your button and get 250% extra damage, which is great. Maybe the first 50 times you do it. But when you're at CD3 and every fight is you doing this 10 times, and you've now destroyed your controller's X button as well as your thumb or index or whatever you use, I found that this became exhausting after any amount of time, and it actually made me play shorter sessions of the game until I was done.
Well, you know what? Here's what I think happened with me, is that I actually have no memory of this being in the game, and so I must have fainted several times while playing. And maybe half of the game that I remember is all dreams. Not only is Squall in this fucking limbo state, I was in a limbo state as well. Yeah, no, again, this is not, this is, again, part of this podcast that was like, man, there are things from these games that we play and love that we really don't take with us, right?
It's
like, true. This is not in my Final Fantasy VIII suitcase at all. And if it has been, if it was part of this equation in my mind, I'd probably have a much lower opinion of it. But it's just not there.
That's fair. I mean, this is like my detriments to the game, I think, are very easily explainable away as like personal preference. Like some people would find that more engaging than the ATB system that remains characteristic of the series at least until 15, and from my understanding, will not be part of the next game at all. Yeah. But sort of, I find that, I can say I don't jive with the story, but my core issues is I think I just didn't like the gameplay that much because of these things. And that's kind of it. There are other complaints which you can make generally about Final Fantasy games, such as like random encounters in the overworld becoming kind of annoying after a certain period of time because you want to get from one location to the other. These are smaller critiques that I think you can levy at the game, and it's sort of like, well, maybe you just don't like Final Fantasy combat design. 12 and 15 don't have that, and I like them very much because you have to go find the enemies and manually attack them. You're not like your play isn't interrupted if you don't want it to be. I think my last call on this. Actually, you know what? I'm gonna flip it because I think you've kind of convinced me. So I'm gonna say, I think because of how unique this game is and everything, it is closer to the middle than it was when we started this discussion. It's still not going to be in my top choices, but I think I will carve out a grade for it that is sort of like this is a very unique assignment that maybe doesn't always land it, but I'm happy it exists as a counterpoint. And I'm actually going to talk about like two things in this game that I think are exceptional that I liked when I played it.
Yeah. Let's go.
So, number one, the soundtrack. I think this game made me open up Internet Explorer and go find, I think it was called Final Fantasy VIII, which had MIDI rips in QuickTime of the soundtrack in like 35-second loops. And that was like me listening to game soundtracks because songs like, I think, is Force Away the song for 8? I think is the battle theme.
I believe it is, yeah. Find Your Way.
They rip.
Yeah, no, Force Your Way.
The game music in this is excellent.
Okay, so I deliberately did not include this as a point because I was like, I think he's going to know that this game has the best music out of all the Final Fantasies because it does. This soundtrack slaps, guys.
I'm going to make a case that I don't. It's like in my top 3. It might not be my number 1, but I think that would probably be a thing of like my top 3 are a 3-way split between 8, 10, and 15.
No, I mean, listen, music is super subjective.
For battle music.
Musical taste is super subjective, but
I'm wrong.
You're not wrong. No, absolutely not. No one's wrong for the music they like. I mean, unless you're, I don't know. I don't want to throw any terrible pop stars under the bus here. Like what you like, and don't yuck someone else's yum. But this soundtrack truly is incredible. It's composed almost itself as an opera. It is amazing. Yeah. But I mean, listen. The lowest Final Fantasy soundtrack is an 8 out of 10 in like any book. And so
they've always been excellent.
They're amazing. And given how much I like this game, I have an extreme fondness for this soundtrack. And I was kind of hoping that you would also at least recognize that this music is really strong.
Yeah. What are the other themes? The Extreme?
Yeah, the first chunk of the final boss.
Yeah. Those two songs I remember forever. Okay, now my last point, I'm kind of surprised you didn't mention it because I'm pretty sure we've talked about this. So I have 2 words for the audience. Tetramaster.
Okay.
Which is this is the card game inside of Final Fantasy VIII, where most Final Fantasies have a mini game in it after, I think 8 is the first one that starts this trend. I can't remember if 7 has a card game in it. But 8 and 9 definitely have card games, and they've been a recurring motif in games since. I think 10 and 10-2 have Blitzball instead. The game was just good. Like, this is like early. This is like for people who played The Witcher 3 and are like, I spent 15 hours playing Gwent. This is that, but 10 years earlier.
Yeah, and I mean, listen, when I played this for the first and second time, I collected every card. I did the whole thing. But again, it's not in my suitcase, right? It's not the thing. And I love card games. I love them. But to me, that's not, even though it's really good, that's not what makes this shine for me, right?
But I like it as this game starts this for the franchise as a pace changer from the rest of the story. To your point of like, maybe there's padding in the game. Maybe the core game isn't that long.
Yeah.
And my last critique about it, which really, it's just like, man, the last 25% of the story is completely unhinged.
No, it's like
we're really like season 4 of True Blood Billith levels of like, oh, we've gone all the way now.
I fully agree with that too. The way I thought about this now is like, why did this never bother me? Why did this never bother me when I'm bothered by something like Pythagoras in AC Odyssey, right? I'm like, this is way more unhinged. One, I was definitely way younger when I played it, and so this kind of swerve didn't matter. But also, I think the idea, if the thing that I'm focusing on thematically from this game is that constant push and drive against duty, the stakes are raised to what your duty is to such an extreme degree, and the characters are still like, I have to do this, right? And I think there's some value in that, but that is like my most generous read of the
That's
way
fair.
that this goes. And I have to say, like, I love me a villain. This game doesn't really have one, and like, if I could recast the way the arc of this game goes, I think someone like Cypher, who's the rival in this game, who you share the opening cutscene with,
Oh yeah.
I think if post Adia arc, because he now no longer has a like that validation that he was seeking from this parent figure, he just goes super unhinged and is the ultimate villain, because that's what happened when your duty is unmoored to an ideology. Like, I think that's a way more compelling story
Yes.
than what we got.
He
But
him not
listen,
being
I'm not going to hold it against the game that they
okay,
weren't there yet in 98, 97 when they were making this, right?
I have two things to end the podcast with. So
Yes.
first, can you describe to me the villain's plan in one sentence? Like one common word sentence. Like what is it that
She's going
ultimately
to
says
compress time.
for what reason?
Okay, because if she slams all of time together, it
Mm-hmm.
means everything, ever,
Mm-hmm.
everywhere, is
Mm-hmm.
in one place, both physically, spatially, temporally. Okay?
So her
And this
plot
means
is
she gets to rule
every
everything. Literally
so
everything.
so her plan is a knockoff version of Evangelion's plotline.
I mean, this all builds, like, if you think of like the level of the anime, like Gurren Lagann, which was kind of
Yeah.
fucked up and weird. So you don't need to watch it, but I mean, if that's your thing, that's your thing. But like where they start throwing galaxies at one another, it's
Fair.
that in Final Fantasy form of like,
And
you know,
now you're checkmating
Kefka
me.
wanted to be God. Sephiroth wanted to just like eat the soul of the planet. How do we one up ourselves? Let's just make all of time one, and then everything. That's the stakes for this villain, is everything.
Fair.
Right? And
I
then
mean,
they
9
dialed
is
it
about,
way back in 9, right?
well, not really, because the villain in
Oh,
9,
I
the true
always
final villain,
no, the true no.
everyone forgets because it's
Yeah.
bullshit. This is my one indictment of 9 that you can always make is the last like 5% flip is real stupid.
That's why you got to nail the
Now-
landing, you know.
It's true. Now, my final thing about this, because we always do segments,
Yes.
is I would like you to pitch me a version of Final Fantasy VIII that is developed by a different studio to better effect if they're making it today. Like, who would you want to make this?
I would want it to be made by the folks who made Fallout New Vegas, Obsidian.
Mm-hmm.
And then I would play it only in Fallout New Vegas style. And my character would be Renoa. Of course, I would character create her because that's what you would do in this game. And I would find a dog that I would use as my gun as I go through the time-crunched wasteland that was established after we fail to defeat the boss in the original game. So it wouldn't be a remake. It would be kind of like Final Fantasy VII Remake, where it's actually this weird alternate timeline sequel where you didn't win the game and you effectively go through the planet, this now black hole of everythingness, and what that looks like inside as ruled over by this ultimate sorceress, because surely there's going to be something inside. Like, she's not just ruling over nothing, right? There's going to be this dome sphere inner world where, you know, dinosaurs are living next to, I don't know, robots, and you as this resistance member a la Andor, are having to deal with the new world order, and I will do
your
so
allegiances
with my dog cannon. And that is the game that I would like. So it's either going to be Obsidian making that, a la like gritty wasteland adventure, or it's going to be the Saints Row people, and it's going to be completely unhinged. That's my Final Fantasy VIII remake.
Can't argue with that.
How can you? Before we do go, I have one segment, and I would like you to tell me, based on your view, which Game of Thrones character is Final Fantasy VIII.
Oh, God. As a unified character?
Yeah.
I think this character's Renly Baratheon.
Oh my God, you're so good at this.
I feel like this game starts off so promising, and you have so much hope about what it's going to be like, and then it just ends prematurely slaughtered
and
by
then
the halfway point of the story shifting and telling you that everything you thought was important, in my case, was really not.
Yeah, and then by the end of the story, everyone's forgotten that Renly is a character. Yeah, you're completely right.
It's true.
Wow. Well, I think that's good for now. Do you have any last comments you want to make on Final Fantasy VIII?
Draw stock is bullshit, but otherwise, not really.
It is the best Final Fantasy. No, okay, like what you like, and we'll see you next time on Have You Played. Thanks for listening.
Bye.